This is no fairy tale. I'm not here to paint you a picture of cosy cafes or candlelit pubs or quaint cobbled streets, because some of the history of York is far from quaint. It has been bloody, it has been fearful, and it has been brutal. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to sugarcoat it in this episode, because these are 5 of some of York's very real and very grim tales.
York has stood for nearly 2,000 years. It has survived invasion, religious violence, public execution and epidemic disease. And each time the city rebuilt itself, it did so on top of what came before, burying its dead, sealing away its shame, and laying fresh stone over old wounds. Some of those stories were carved into stone and set into plaques. Others were whispered, passed down and half forgotten. And some were buried so deeply that only the places themselves remember what happened there.
Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I'm Claire, this is the Wanderlust Way. First off, let me say a massive thank you to everybody that supports this channel by liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing, and becoming members and sending super thanks, because honestly everything that you do helps the channel to grow. It allows me to carry on making videos like this and share the stories that I find with you. So today we are in York to hear 5 of its grim tales. These are tales of execution, of mass murder and disease. They are certainly not for the faint-hearted. So if you are ready for that kind of grim history talk through the city, then grab your coats, wrap up warm. That's enough waffle. Let's wander. Our first stop is the iconic Clifford Tower, which is a landmark in York's landscape. It sits high on the mound and it's very close to, say, the York Castle Museum, which we filmed at Christmas if you were here on the channel then. And it's also a stone's throw from, say, the Jorvik Viking Centre and some of the city's many bars and restaurants. However, this site is anything but charming, because it played host in 1190 in March to one of the worst massacres in medieval history.
After the Norman conquest of 1066, Jewish families began arriving in England from northern France. The new Norman rulers needed vast sums of money to secure their kingdom, to build castles, raise armies and maintain control. But Christian law forbade lending money for profit. Jewish law, however, did not. As a result, Jewish communities became financially essential to the crown, and they settled in England's major cities, including York. Many of York's Jewish community spoke French, the language of the Norman court, as well as Hebrew, which further set them apart in medieval England. They lived, however, under royal protection, but that protection bred resentment. By the late 12th century, hostility had hardened into hatred. Public theological disputes between Jewish scholars and Christian churchmen sharpened divisions, and at the same time, vicious lies began to circulate. Accusations that Jews murdered Christian children in ritual killings. These stories were completely false, but they were believed. By 1190, England was caught up in crusading fever. Calls to fight in the Holy Land heightened suspicion toward anyone who was not Christian. Debt weighed heavily on York citizens, and resentment turned quickly into violence.
There is a sign at the bottom of the Clifford's Mount that reads, "On the night of Friday the 16th of March 1190, some 150 Jews and Jewesses of York, having sought protection in the royal castle on this site from a mob cited by Richard Malbise and others, chose to die at each other's hands rather than renounce their faith."
When unrest broke out in the city, Jewish families fled here, to the royal castle, believing the king's authority would protect them. At first, they were allowed inside the wooden tower that once stood on this mound, on the site of what is now Clifford's Tower. But trust collapsed. When the castle keeper left on other business, the Jews refused to let him back in, fearing betrayal. That refusal was seen as a direct challenge to royal authority. Troops joined the mob outside, stones were thrown, the tower was besieged. Friday the 16th of March 1190 fell on Shabbat Hagadol, the great Sabbath before Passover, one of the most sacred moments in the Jewish calendar. Inside the tower, families understood that no help was coming, and rather than be forcibly baptised or slaughtered by the mob waiting outside, they chose death. Fathers killed their wives and children, then they took their own lives. A fire started out, and it's still uncertain who started it, but many say it was the Jews themselves who set the fire to their possessions they had brought with them. The flames consumed the timber tower itself. It is estimated that around 150 Jewish men, women and children died here that night. A small number were offered safe passage if they agreed to convert, but when they emerged from the burning tower, they too were murdered. Afterwards, records of debts owed to the Jewish community were deliberately destroyed. There were fines, there were gestures of authority, but there was no justice. The city carried on. Around 60 years later, the stone tower we see today was built. Grass softened the mound, time dulled the memory. But every spring, daffodils are said to bloom here, their six-pointed shape echoing the Star of David. A quiet reminder that this place holds memories of one of the worst anti-Semitic massacres of the Middle Ages.
Our next stop brings us to the Ouse Bridge, which is the site, the location of one of the worst executions in York's history. Now, the lady that was executed here, she wasn't an ordinary criminal, shall we say, in the sense she wasn't a thief, she wasn't a murderer. She was just a woman trying to help others. Now, there is a sign here. It says, near to this place, Margaret Clitheroe of York, saint of the Catholic Church, was martyred for her Christian faith on 25th of March 1586.
Margaret Clitheroe's life wasn't outwardly dramatic. She was born Margaret Middleton, and she married John Clitheroe, a successful butcher. Their home on the Shambles was well placed and comfortable. They weren't struggling. They had security, status and a future. What set Margaret apart wasn't rebellion, it was belief. She converted to Catholicism at a time when doing so was dangerous. By the 1580s, Catholic priests were considered traitors. Saying Mass in secret could cost you your freedom or your life. Margaret knew that, and still, she helped. Priests were hidden in her home. Mass was said quietly and out of sight, not for money and not for influence, simply because she believed it was the right thing to do. When she was arrested in 1586, Margaret was taken to the prison that stood at the end of Ouse Bridge. She was heavily pregnant. At her trial, she was ordered to plead guilty or not guilty, but she refused. She understood exactly what that silence would mean. A guilty plea would strip her family of their property and leave her children destitute. A non-guilty plea would almost certainly end in execution. By refusing to speak, Margaret believed she was protecting those she loved. The law, however, saw it differently. She was sentenced to death by pressing, a punishment rarely used and designed to force submission through pain. The execution took place on Good Friday. The men officially assigned to carry it out refused. They would not do it. They could not do it. So instead, 4 beggars were paid to take their place. Margaret was brought here to the toll booth on the bridge. A handkerchief was tied across her face. She was laid on the ground on a sharp stone, and a door, taken from her own house, was placed on top of her body. Weights were added, 700 to 800 weight. It took around 15 minutes for Margaret Clitheroe to die. But her body was left there under the weight for 6 hours, exposed, broken, unattended. Later it said one of her hands was removed, and that hand still exists, mummified and preserved, and is kept today at the Bar Convent in York. Centuries later, Margaret Clitheroe was declared a saint. But here, on this bridge, she wasn't treated as holy. She wasn't even treated as human. She was punished for choosing compassion over obedience and for trying in her own quiet way to help others survive. And every time we cross this bridge without knowing her name, her story slips a little further into silence.
Stop number 3 brings us to a site just outside the York railway station. And what I think is fascinating, especially about cities as historic as York, is that around every corner there's always a little bit of history beneath our feet, reminding us of the events that happened before. So this is the cholera burial ground. Now, I'll just briefly read the sign to you. It says it's specially acquired for the burial of some of the 185 victims of a plague of cholera, which lasted from the 3rd of June to the 22nd of October, 1832. There are 20 surviving memorial stones, all of sandstone.
Cholera reached York in 1832, and when it did, it arrived with fear long before anyone understood what it was or where it came from. At the time, people referred to it as the pestilence of India, something distant and foreign, the kind of threat you imagined belonged elsewhere, not in a city like this, until suddenly it did. York had just over 25,000 people living here then. By the end of that summer, at least 450 had been struck down, and 185 were dead. No one really knew why. Medical opinion was divided. Some believed the illness drifted through the air, carried on foul smells and stagnant vapours. Others thought it passed from person to person. Germ theory existed, but very few took it seriously, and certainty was in short supply. What people did understand was how the disease behaved once it took hold. It came on quickly and violently. Severe diarrhoea, vomiting, intense cramping and dehydration followed in rapid succession, and in some cases death arrived within hours. To those watching, it felt as though life itself was being drained from the body. York did try to respond. There were inspections and advice, warnings issued, and efforts made to clean up the worst of the city's conditions. But none of it was enough to stop the deaths. The city's first known victim was a waterman named Thomas Hughes, who lived in one of York's most notorious courts, just off Skeldergate, a cramped, filthy place where several families shared a single privy, and flooding cesspits were a constant problem. Before he fell ill, Hughes crossed the river for a drink. The landlord of the inn died the next day. Hughes himself survived, but others around him weren't so lucky. As the number of deaths increased, the city faced another urgent problem: where to bury the bodies. York's churchyards were already overcrowded, and cholera victims were feared even after death. Authorities ordered that burials should take place within 12 hours and that graves needed to be deep, both to contain infection and to calm public anxiety. So, this patch of ground outside the city walls and away from everyday life was set aside, and the dead were brought here in haste, often at night, often without the kind of service families would have expected. There are only around 20 memorial stones here today. Most of them that were buried here were never really marked at all.
So this headstone, for example, reads, "Sacred to the memory of," I don't know if that's Eleanor or Eliza Glenn, who departed this life July the 1st, 1832, aged 6 years, bless her. This lovely bud, so young and fair, called hence by early doom, just came to show how sweet a flower in paradise would bloom. Also of William Ellison, who departed this life July 1st, 1832, aged 42 years. So the blimey, yeah, same day.
Funerals themselves became flashpoints of fear. Some families were told services couldn't be held inside churches, which caused anger and resentment. Coffins struggled to cross the river, and at one point a frightened crowd even threw a coffin into the Ouse, convinced that it was safer there than passing through the streets. Bodies were wrapped in tarred cloth, and a covered cart was used to transport them. Cholera didn't just kill people. It exposed how fragile everything was, how quickly order, dignity and certainty could collapse. Years later, a York-born doctor named John Snow would finally prove that the disease spread through contaminated water. By then, it was far too late for the people buried here. The city argued over this land for years. Politics, religion and legal challenges all played a part. And yet, despite everything, the burial ground remained. The dead stayed where they were put.
We've reached our second to last stop, and I think this is obviously the perfect time after all those grim tales to have some refreshment. So it just so happens that this stop is a pub, and it is the King's Arms. Now this place, it has lots of local stories behind it. If you're from York, you'll know it, that this is the place that floods when the River Ouse decides to spread its waters. However, this pub does also have another local legend surrounding it, and it's a grim one.
The building we're outside now is known as the King's Arms, but for much of its earlier life it was known as the Ouse Bridge Inn, named simply because of where it stands, right beside Ouse Bridge. And that matters because this bridge has never been just a way of getting from one side of the river to the other. For centuries it was part of how justice was carried out in the city. There was a small prison on the bridge itself, and as we know from the story of Margaret Clitheroe, executions happened here too, in full view of the public. During medieval and Tudor times, it wasn't uncommon for people crossing here to see bodies, sometimes whole, sometimes only in part. The whole spectacle was no doubt a rancid, horrid affair. But what happened to those bodies afterwards is where this place comes into the story. It's long been said that after executions, the bodies of the condemned were brought down from the bridge and laid out in the cellar of this building. There's no single surviving document that confirms that, beyond doubt, but it's a story that appears again and again in local tradition and historic archive captions. And when you look at how cities like York worked at that time, it's not hard to see why the stories endured. Bodies had to go somewhere. Places close to execution sites were often used simply because they were there. And here, of course, you also have the river. Right outside the door is King's Staithe, one of York's historic river landings. This was a working edge of the city where goods arrived, cargo was unloaded, and the river was part of everyday life. It's been long believed that some bodies were disposed of directly into the River Ouse from this stretch of riverbank. Again, there's no neat record of names or dates, but rivers were often used this way. They carried things away quietly, without ceremony, and without drawing attention in a crowded city. Even today, the river still shapes this place. Being here, it's hard not to think about how many times water has crossed that threshold and how many things the river has carried past this spot over the centuries. Because when a place sits for long enough between land and water, between practicality and punishment, stories don't just disappear. They stay with the place, whether the visitors stopping for a drink inside realise that or not.
We are now at the final stop on our trail, and this is the Plague House. Now, the story that I'm about to tell you, this, I'm told, often pops up on lots of the York ghost walks. And whether you believe in ghosts or not, you can't deny that this story is incredibly haunting.
Plague had been part of life in England for centuries. The Black Death devastated the country in the 14th century, and outbreaks returned again and again. By the time of the Great Plague of the 17th century, people had grown used to living with the threat of it, even if they never truly understood it. They didn't know about bacteria or fleas or rats carrying infection from place to place. What they did know was that plague seemed to spread quickly and that proximity could be deadly. So rules emerged. Houses suspected of infection were marked, doors were sealed, families were isolated from the outside world in the hope of protecting the wider community. And it's within that fear-filled context that the story of this house is told. The tale says that during a plague outbreak, a family living here fell ill. The parents died, and their young daughter, believed to be infected too, was locked inside the house along with them. The authorities thought they were doing the right thing, but according to the story, they were wrong. The girl didn't have the plague. She wasn't sick. She was simply sealed inside a house with no food, no water, and no way out. She is said to have died slowly, not from disease, but from starvation. There's no surviving record to confirm her name, her age, or even the exact year this happened. Stories like this were passed on orally, shaped by memory and retelling. But the practice itself, sealing houses and isolating families, leaving people to fend for themselves, is historically documented. And that's what gives this story its weight. Over the years, people have claimed to hear crying near the house. Others say they've seen a child's face in the upstairs window looking out onto the street, tear-stained, watching and waiting. Now, whether that's imagination, suggestion, or something else entirely is up to you. But standing here, it's hard not to think about the logic of the time, about how fear of disease could outweigh compassion, about how protecting the many sometimes meant abandoning the few, and about how easily cruelty can be justified when people believe they're acting in the name of safety. This story has endured not just because it's dramatic, but because it forces an uncomfortable question. When fear takes hold, how far are people willing to go? And at what point does protection turn into something far darker?
So that brings us to the end of the video, to the end of this dark trail through York's grim historical past. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please let me know in the comments what you thought, which of these stories you already knew, if any of these have been brought new to light to you, I'd love to know. And if you'd like another video like this in York, do let me know as well. I think let's set a little challenge. So I think if this video does well, say we hit 15,000 likes, if we hit 15,000 views, then we will do a part 2. So that's up to you guys. If you enjoyed it, then we can make that happen. So without further ado, I hope to see you on next week's episode. Take care, stay safe, stay curious, and keep wandering.